Hello and welcome to Global South Adda. Global South Adda is a series of chats about the broader issues of relevance to the scholarship that either come from the Global South or the scholarship that is done on the Global South. And we try to not overindulge in academic jargons and keep the discussions more to the practicalities of reading, thinking, and writing about and from the Global South, specifically in the discipline of international relations. We are being hosted by NICE, the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, and we're very grateful to the team at NICE for providing us this platform. Today in our discussion, we'll focus on everyone's current favorite theme in IR, decolonizing IR. Now, if you've engaged with the discipline in any form and do not pride yourself with, pretensions of being overtly Zen, chances are that you were provoked by the recent debates about securitization and race in IR. A lot has been written about it, a lot has been said about it, tweeted about it, it's all over social media. So we'll not contribute to everyone's agony by mentioning the specifics of the case or going into the specifics of the case. But the whole affair did raise a whole lot of questions about racism, bullying, the need for decolonizing, quality of scholarship, academic freedom. And these are issues which are important beyond the specifics of the case. Also, everyone seemed to worry in particular about how the toxicity of the whole debate will impact young scholars working on race, especially in the Global South. Although, curiously, no one really cared to ask the young scholars, especially in the Global South, on how they are actually feeling about it. So we thought it would be nice to have some very bright and unabashedly provocative young scholars discuss the issues. But we'll focus more on the kinds of problems they face while writing and thinking within the discipline. I'm thus very glad to welcome 6 IR scholars from the Global South, whose work I am myself genuinely excited by. So we have, some of them work in the Global South, while others are relatively recent migrants to the Global North, and hence would probably be able to weigh equally on the differences and problems of working in the Global South as well as in the Global North. So we have today with us Liberty from Amsterdam, Mohammed Sese from Toronto, Sashi Kumar Sundaram from the currently troubled city of Washington, DC, Ananya and Krushi from the always troubled city of Delhi, and Sitan Bele from the, I guess, slightly chilly Pretoria. So very welcome, everyone. I think at the start, we should sort of go around and say very, very briefly a couple of lines about the work we do, and then we get on to the discussions. Liberty, I guess you could go first.
Hi, yes, my name is Liberty Chee, and I'm originally from the Philippines. And the last 10 years, I've moved around a lot, and I'm most currently in the Netherlands, and I'm a lecturer at the Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam. So I'm interested basically in investigating migrant domestic work as a phenomenon and working through it through the lenses of IR theory. So some of the themes that I've touched on before, that I've worked on before, has to do with global governance and the conception of power in global governance, resilience as a concept, and most currently I'm trying to launch this project that will look into knowledge production about domestic work and in the context of the ILO. So yes, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mohammed Sise. I'm originally from Sierra Leone, but currently I am based in Canada. I recently started a new job as an assistant professor, and that has been taking all of my time. I'm doing some teaching, but let me say something briefly about the research that I do. I am interested in the sort of a production and diffusion of international norms, particularly in terms of how they are being transferred and sort of diffused in the Global South. I focus specifically on international criminal justice norms and the rule of law. at the moment. And I really want to thank Vineet for organizing this forum, because it's sort of going to serve as a motivation for me, because I'm working on my book manuscript. And I'm looking at what I call the domination by law, and the role of internationalization of the rule of law in reinforcing domination in the global south. It is a book, hopefully, that will be published in a series by Rowan and Littlefield. They have a series called International Relations and the Colonial Questions. So how lucky I am to be part of this conversation. And I believe at the end of the day, I would get motivated to go back to where I am in writing the manuscript. I have other side projects that I have been working on. One of them is what I call the contestation of international criminal justice in Africa. I've been looking at the relationship between the African Union and the International Criminal Court, the ICC, but also looking at other specific cases like what's happening in Uganda, in Sierra Leone. But it's just one of my other side projects. But for now, I'm giving all my time in trying to get my manuscript.
Great. Shashi.
Hello, everyone. I am Shashi Kumar Sundaram from the south of India, Tamil Nadu, originally, and I finished my PhD at the Central European University in Budapest. And now I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the American University in Washington, DC. I'm also affiliated as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. My research is focused on the question of reputation of states in international politics, particularly from the perspective of the global south, Brazil, India, and China. And I work on, or I'm interested in questions of international relations theory, questions relating to how do we do international relations theory, epistemological questions, and what is it in general that we need to do in order to make sure that the international relations field is a plural field to accommodate divergent perspectives. That's it. Thank you.
Ananya.
Hi, my name is Ananya. I've done my PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and I'm currently an assistant professor at Ashoka University. My research interests, at least for my PhD, were looking at the intellectual disciplinary history of international relations through three concepts: utopia, tradition, and progress, and kind of evaluating the disciplinary debates that happened within the course of evolution of the discipline, and what role would utopian imaginary play in like kind of envisioning a different path for IR as it is. And I'm also working on turning my PhD into a book, so that's what's happening currently. Thank you.
Khushi.
Hi, I'm Khushi. I'm a PhD candidate at Jawaharlal Nehru University in International Politics, and I'm currently working on life and experiences of Vijayalakshmi Pandit as the first female diplomat of India. So I broadly look at women in diplomacy and gender in diplomacy, and also the forgotten histories of women in the making of what is IR and what transpired in international politics.
Hi, I'm Stembi Lembete. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria, where I also did my PhD, looking at South Africa's foreign policy as a middle power in its two terms in the, well, then it was two terms in the UN Security Council, so 2007-8 and 2011-12. South Africa serving again in the Security Council. And so I wrote my PhD kind of looking at South African foreign policy from a middle power lens, but one of the things that emerged from my research is that as much as critical race theory has developed and is influencing IR theory, no one looks at South Africa through the lens and South Africa's international relations through the lens of critical race theory. And when South Africa was the most important race conflict in history, arguably, you know, at least in the 20th century. And so that's what I'm doing now, is using critical race theory to examine South Africa historically and in the present.
Excellent, brilliant. So guys, but I thought that in order for us to maximize time, we'll focus on 4 broad themes during the course of this conversation, and take up each of these themes one by one. So I'll refer to the theme and sort of, bundle a few questions and then throw them at you, and then you can take, a couple of minutes to sort of think through them and speak about them. The first broad set of questions I wanted to raise about were the questions of representation in the decolonizing IR debate. I'm specifically referring to the decolonizing debate, not IR in general. And sort of, if I have to put it more provocatively, does decolonize IR need to decolonize itself? And let me sort of explain. If you look at the whole discussions on decolonizing IR, it seems to me that it is also almost entirely sort of dominated by scholars who are working in the West. So if you look through special issues, ISS sections, roundtables, blog posts, conferences, workshops, citation practices, I mean, there are a number of ways. And if you look at them, the whole political economy of even the decolonizing IR debate, to me, is dominated quite a lot by scholars in the West. And in some ways, it's, one could say it's white people plus expats who do decolonizing IR. Now, of course, I don't mean to say in a sort of derisive sense, and I'm not trying to throw shade at the people who are doing it. They're absolutely wonderful people. There's absolutely wonderful work being done by scholars located in the West. But that's not my point. The point is that at some point, everyone needs to sort of take a step back and start asking about whose voices need to be amplified in this debate. And I am located in a Western university, so I certainly don't think my voice should be the same as somebody who's working in the Philippines or India, for that matter. So there's this question of the space for decolonizing IR. It cannot be almost entirely without any scholars who are actually working in the global South. And then there's a related another problem on which I have a separate rant about, how people seem to think that add Du Bois and Fanon and Stir, and that's all decolonization is about. If you have to sort of think about race, think more about America or Britain. I mean, what is happening in America is horrendous, but I think it also needs, like Siddhamile said, I mean, Rose Must Fall, the whole decolonizing IR movement, actually one could argue starts in South Africa and Rose Must Fall, but no one thinks about, race in South Africa, that's where all of it starts. So in a way, this inordinate focus on countries in the West and that experience seeming to be universal is also reproduced in sort of the decolonizing IR debate sometimes. So how do you feel about this the questions of representation, one? And second, in your own work, what are the problems that you've seen beyond with regard to sort of the whole decolonizing IR thing? And thirdly, how do we move beyond a phase of sort of lamenting? I mean, we can always lament about it, but what do we need to do in order to sort of, I'm not saying that, we need to sort of do away with sort of whole political, we cannot really do away with the whole political economy of the discipline, but what are the sort of creative and tangible ways in which we can sort of contributing to more voices from the global South? All right, who wants to go first? Liberty, since I have you first in the sequence.
Well, I just want to, I think the first time that I heard about the term decolonization in a university context was in 2011 in Frankfurt, Germany, right? And 9 years later, I wonder, why is it that decolonization is such a popular term, mainstream term in the core of knowledge production, right? So in the Philippines, for example, this is not even it's nobody talks about it, right? So in the periphery of knowledge production, nobody talks about decolonization, right? In the semi-periphery, let's say, of Singapore, where I did my PhD, these are marginal conversations, right? And the closer you are to the core, the more resounding, right, the call for decolonization. And I wonder why. I don't have an answer to this question, right? I'm just wondering why, right? And the second point is, it's also often connected to, I don't want to kind of like sideline the conversation, but it's often connected to the conversations about increasing diversity, right, in the university, right? To diversify the student body, to diversify the faculty. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering, right, why all of a sudden in this context, these these terms are very, have become mainstream, and what that does to the critical edge of these concepts to begin with.
Mohammed, you want to go next? Yeah, you have to unmute.
Yes, I would like to sort of build on what Liberty has just said, because for me as well, the term decolonization, the first time I heard it, or the first time I sort of got involved in the discussion about it, is in a conference organized by the ISA, the International Studies Association. And when I did my first degree and master's program at the University of Sierra Leone, no one was talking about decolonization of international relations. And to date, I often go back to Sierra Leone. I interact with scholars in Sierra Leone. This is not part of the conversation in that part of the world. So I share the observation by Liberty. Why is it that this question gets amplified when we come closer to the global center? And I also don't have an answer for that. I would just speculate that maybe part of the issue is that the more we come closer to the center of knowledge production, the global center, I think probably the more there is the increasing awareness of how hierarchical and how dominating the knowledge production is, to the extent that some of us that are trying to be critically minded, or people who are critically minded, they would want to push this discussion. But I'm also aware that the tendency that the people who are engaged in this discussion, they probably have no business in decolonizing IR. They are not the ones that are supposed to do it. So I think for me, that also means that, to your point, Vineet, about creating space, I think it means to me, how do we expand that space to include the voices, the experiences of our colleagues who are based in the global south? Because I believe that they're going to bring an important added value to this conversation, right? Because they have their lived experiences that you're talking about. And that's also one reason why I really appreciate this conversation, because we want to talk about this issue in more practical terms, right? What are the constraints that people are dealing with in engaging in knowledge production in international relations? I think for us here who are, in Canada, for us here who are in the West, in the global center, so to speak, we are closer to white privilege. I think we have a different experiences in engaging this conversation than our colleagues who are still based in the global south. So I think it's a question of how do we expand or recalibrate this space to engage them, right? And I'm not saying here that when I go to Sierra Leone, people are not engaged in this conversation. I'm not saying that they don't have something to say, right? I think we have to create that space to engage them. We have to create that space. Maybe they are talking about this in other terms. They are talking about these issues in other languages, not the language that we use here in the global center. So I think it's a question of how do we expand this conversation? Because I think one of the things that I would say is that we've had this conversation for quite a while. I think I started hearing about this conversation when I started my PhD. But I think we could all agree that the discipline is still colonized, right? We are not seeing, in a way, in my view, the difference that this conversation is supposed to bring. We are not even talking about how do we know that the conversation has brought a difference. And probably part of the reason for that is the engagement with this conversation is very limited, it's very narrow. And probably we need to expand it to include other people who are in different spaces, but also I don't want us to have this conversation here and it ends here. I think we really probably should be thinking of how do we move this conversation about the practical issues into the discipline, right? So for instance, how do people who are in Sierra Leone, who are in India, who are in other parts of the global south, how do they engage in knowledge production and knowledge dissemination? They have a lot of challenges they are going through, right? We are here. There are challenges in publishing, in international organization, in IR journals, but they have their own peculiar challenges in even getting access to these places where people publish their work. I know I'm just ranting, but that's the way I see it, and that's my initial take on this.
Thanks, Vineet. Thanks, Ceci. Those are very important points as well. And I think I'm going to keep my points provocative so that it kind of creates a sort of, conversation. We don't know whether it's going to be an interesting conversation otherwise. I think to a large extent, doing post-colonial or decolonizing IR is not a postal code issue. So there are many scholars who are working from India who are exclusively Western focused in doing mainstream research. And there are many scholars who are working in the West doing questions that are supposed to be within the framework of decolonizing IR. So it's not a postal code issue. So it's not about just bringing those people into the global center, as Ceci said. This is similar to how you count for feminist research by including feminist variable in a statistical research. You don't do feminism just by including a statistical correlation or by controlling for that variable. And having said that, I think I want to make two provocative points just to set the conversation going on hearing your views. One is that I think decolonization itself, or decolonizing IR itself, is a question like objectivity in many ways, and it has two sort of pathways. One is to see decolonization as a product, and another is to see decolonization as a process. And if decolonization is a product, then the idea is to say that through decolonization work, we are thereby producing accurate representation of reality. But that involves a problem because much of decolonization work rests on the understanding of anti-representationalism. So nothing could be objectively represented. And the second is to see decolonization as a process. That is to show that decolonization is untainted by, if we do decolonization, it has a particular value component, and that value component is untainted by other value components such as scientificity, objectivity, measurement, etc. But then this also brings certain problems, because how do you talk about this process to those people who are not committed to understanding decolonization process as a particular way of doing research methods? And this comes to the way we can have issues that Ceci points out, and a particular word that I might want to use here is question of translation. How is it that when someone's working from a particular vantage point can make their research translatable to particular indicators of good research, good within quotes, that other scholars could use in their own theoretical advancement? Again, theoretical advancement I use within quotes because it is a particular perpetuation of a particular theoretical model that keeps going on and on. And this comes from both, and I repeat, this is not coming just from the mainstream international relations theory, but also from the critical securitization school that we saw and the debates that we saw recently. It's about policing the borders into saying what sort of research method, despite understanding that there's a different confusion between research method and methodology, what sort of research method is the most objective, accurate representation of decolonization? If you were to do decolonization, this is how you got to be representing the decolonizing voices. Who is to say that? And this leads to invincible bottomless debate about which is the right sort of representation of decolonization. I think we cannot get in there unless we set a conversation. And one cannot stop or muzzle a conversation before starting it by having methodological imperatives in place, saying that this is not a valid sort of plot, or this is not a valid sort of representation. This is not a proper sort of research method. This is not a proper sort of an interpretation. This is objective relativism. This is just storytelling, narrative. We've all heard of these things. I think that should stop. And finally, this is very much connected to questions of inclusivity and the notion of our job market scenario. We would rather be writing the articles that I am writing. I don't want to speak on behalf of others, but for me, if I had an opportunity to publish the same articles in an Indian Journal of International Relations or Brazilian Journal of International Relations and be equally capable of applying for jobs globally. But that's not the situation out there. An equally strong argument, an equally valid argument that's made in a journal article in Brazil or in India has lesser validity in terms of job applications than an article that is published, even a bad article that is published in European Journal of International Relations. And that shows who has a particular say on what goes on in the world. And the best way to do it is actually be within the system to break the system, rather than to say, here is the Global South scholars, they'll be doing their research, they'll be doing their own things abroad, is to actually push the boundaries and publish their research in European Journal of International Relations or International Security or International Theory or international organization, and question the assumptions. And that comes at a heavy cost, particularly for young scholars, because as any of us would be writing, we'll be facing reviewers who just not be persuaded at all because our voices are not accurate enough, representative enough, good enough, methodologically sound enough, or not policy relevant enough, or not generalizable enough. Quite often we gotta hear that. And as long as this system is in that spin, I don't know if we can get out of it unless we all start a particular manifesto of saying this is how we do decolonizing international relations.
Thank you, Shashi. I mean, you've covered almost all the 4 points that we were supposed to talk about, so we can finish our discussion, I guess, now. But thank you. But we'll come to all these points again on methodology and and all of that. Ananya.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to just briefly touch on maybe 3 points. The first one: when did I first hear about decolonization? Like all the narratives and stories that you guys were talking about. I think it was a Millennium Conference in 2016, which was titled "Erasure's Expropriation of Knowledge Production in IR" or something. And I was like, oh, okay, let's apply for this. And I'd applied for Millennium before, did not get through. And that was the first time I got through Millennium. And so I went for the conference, and it just surprised me that there were so many scholars that I'd never heard of. And I was in my second year of PhD then, and they were all talking about all these scholars in this conference. And then I came back, and as a student, you feel very unsettled by you've not engaged with so much literature that's out there in the world. So I was like, oh, okay, maybe I should engage and read these works. And then I kept on asking myself, why is it that we've done a master's in IR, then we did our MPhil in IR, and it's called international relations. Both the degrees are called, you get a degree in international. Why is it that we don't engage with these scholars? And I realized that's because I think within the Indian context, we are still very much, we still consider IR very much like a sub-discipline or a periphery of a larger political science, kind of a disciplinary head. And then you have all these branches rooting out, right? And IR as a discipline feels immense insecurity, at least in the context of India, I can say that, to establish itself as a full-fledged discipline that can have its own debates, that can think about itself critically, right? So I think within the larger discipline, which is pol science, you have to posture yourself in a certain way. And the closest you come to posturing in relation to pol science is by thinking about hard issues like security, strategy, nuclear weapons, Pakistan, China, right? There's nothing wrong in thinking about those things, but I think it's just maybe one of those things that gives us some sense of, stability as both young scholars and people who've established the discipline that, hey, we're doing relevant. I think the second point is about location, which is public university versus private university. And this is something that I've realized over the last 1.5 years that I've been working. I think it's probably in my naive ideal world, I think it was way easier to have certain conversations in public universities than it is to have those conversations in private universities, which I was quite surprised because I thought maybe people are going to be, the larger environment is going to be more conducive to like kind of certain conversations, but that's something that even I've been reflecting on even more and more. I don't have an answer why, but I think there is like kind of a push for critical thinking space much more in public universities, which the space is increasingly being co-opted, rebranded by the current government in power, but clearly there was a space that was available there, right? And the third thing about decolonization that I want to reflect on is, as my like new role as somebody who teaches IR, right? And when you start being on the other side of I don't know, like the equation where you're not a student anymore and you're like, you have some force of authority in terms of designing curriculum, shaping curriculum. I think it's quite unsettling, particularly because you don't know, you've been trained in a certain way, given certain reading lists that have gone on for generations. And those reading lists are like a staple, whether it is Delhi University, whether it's any other colleges that do deal with international relations. How do you challenge that? How do you like introduce something that is not like, I don't know, mainstream pedigree of international relations? And would you qualify as teaching IR? I don't know if you suddenly like, I'm going to start with Fanon. And I remember Vineet saying that like, oh, in SOAS, he started like teaching with Fanon. And I was like, in my head, I was just thinking, I aspire to do that, but I don't know if I can ever like kind of do that in Indian context. So I don't know, for me, that idea of designing reading lists and designing courses itself has been quite an experience in terms of just understanding decolonization as a process. I don't attempt to like know everything about it, but it's a constant struggle to like kind of maintain that. Yeah, so those are my 3 points that I want to start the conversation with. And I'll come to Shashi's point at some point in methodology. Thanks.
Thanks. Chee.
Yeah, so I think what Ananya and Shashi said, and I mostly agree with everything actually here. And I think all 4 of these sub-themes are very closely interrelated. Like, I don't think we can like really separate them. Beginning with, when did I first hear of decolonial IR? It was as recent as 2017. It was my second year as an MPhil student, and it did not happen in India. I had gone for Millennium Conference only that year, and suddenly I go there and I see this, these authors and this one entire stream of literature, and as Ananya rightly said, I had no idea about. Like, I think I felt so out of place just because of the sheer lack of knowledge, the sheer lack of not knowing enough. And as a friend later told me from an American university that, oh, have you heard of decolonial IR? It's the new hot thing. So, that was my introduction to decolonial theory. And I think a lot of it is, of course, as Ananya and Sasi and what they've said, that a lot of it also has to do with, as you said, that where Indian IR is, and how we are taught about these questions of race and identity within the discipline. Because when I look back, and my master's was in political science, and off late I've been thinking about it, I didn't have a single paper that I can remember which discussed these questions. And most of our syllabuses also, now that we look at, barring probably 1 or 2 papers, are so heavily dependent, or so heavily drawing from Western scholarship, right? Which again is what Sasi said, right? Like, and like, I'll come back to this, but like, one thing, as Ananya was talking and I was thinking about it, and a colleague had mentioned it 2 years back or 3 years back, was also this. He just said that I don't understand critical IR. I don't understand decolonial, post-colonial, all this IR, because I don't understand their language. I don't understand their vocabulary. For someone who's coming from a vernacular medium of language, that person just did not understand what these people were saying. So he would say that I understand realism and I understand foreign policy texts because they're simple. I know I can argue that. And I think that is also something that we really, really need to talk about, because what happens is, we are talking about breaking that hierarchy, but we are again creating that hierarchy because there's also a class component here about who goes ahead to make what arguments and where. And we have to keep that in mind. when we are talking about breaking these hierarchies, and we are talking about making it inclusive, because even within Global South, someone like me who went to certain kind of institutions and can present herself a certain way and can speak English, which is a big factor over here, will be able to consolidate my place a lot better than a scholar who's probably a lot brighter than me, but does not know the language. So there, when we are talking about being allies in whatever way, it's also important, where do we learn to give that space? So these are just a few thoughts at the top of my head. So that's where I'll leave. Yeah.
Great. So the Mile.
Oh, so much that I want to draw from and respond to, but I won't, because we'll be here forever. I want to just start by saying that I think that the point that Liberty made about that the closer you come to the core, the more resounding the call for decolonization, I think is a really important one. And for me, it's an important one from I'm in Joburg, I'm not in Pretoria, so from Johannesburg in South Africa, because there's, you know, part of why there's been such a big decolonizing conversation in South Africa is because of this awkward place that we sort of fit into as being in Africa, but not really of Africa, being a settler colony. So very similar in character to a Canada or a United States or on Australia in that respect, by being a majority Black country, but being culturally very Western in many of the practices and things within our political economy and within our society, and particularly within the academy. And so the conversation on decolonization has been going on in varying permutations, sometimes using the wording and not, in South Africa since 1994. And my introduction to decolonization didn't come from political science, it didn't come from IR. It came from Black scholars in South African universities working on other issues. So Sabelo Ndlovu-Gajeni, who wrote the book on coloniality of power in post-colonial Africa, and that's from 2013. Achille Mbembe, who wrote on post-coloniality, Tshepo Madlingozi, who's a legal scholar. So Prof. Ndlovu-Gajeni is a historian, Tshepo is a legal scholar who was writing about decoloniality within the context of South Africa's constitutional order. Mokgobe Ramose, who's a philosopher, he's written quite a bit, and written very provocatively challenging sort of Hegel, and so that for me is where those conversations were first happening. And I think that the first IR scholar I ever came across who was writing about decoloniality was Professor Spamandla Zondi, who was writing and sort of using the work of like Maldonado Torres, or all of those Latin American scholars on decoloniality, and then applying it to IR and to politics. And that is a lot of what the inspiration then was also around Roads Must Fall, was that the young people who were taking part of in that, and I always joke that, I did my undergraduate up to my master's at UCT, but we were trying to fight for equality in the marking. So we were trying to argue for like blind marking to remove race discrimination. So we walked past roads and we never thought of it. So it was this big thing and really, really important, but it was people who were inspired by all of these other writers outside of politics, outside of IR. And it's true, I only came to decolonial IR while I was doing my PhD in 2016, 2015. And I find that so interesting then how those Western scholars of decolonial IR have dominated the conversation. So the people that I reference when I think about decolonial IR, those Western don't even know who the hell that is. So I was really excited last year that both Prof. Ndlovu-Gajeni and Spamandla Zondi were on the gave keynote addresses at Millennium. which was really important. And so I think that it's interesting. So firstly, I think that the proximity to the core of knowledge production is a really important dimension to this conversation about decolonial IR. And for me, that is what differentiates also the way in which the conversation is happening in South Africa to the way that it's happening in other countries on the African continent, right? So as Mohammed was saying, you know, if you go to Sierra Leone, no one is going to be worried about, you know, no, that's not a preoccupation in the conversation. And so this weird place, I think, where South Africa is both globally but within the continent, I think is one of the reasons why it's become such an issue here. And it raises interesting questions, though, around representativity, because still when we are teaching decolonial IR here, or decoloniality, we're still relying on Latin American authors, we're still relying on a few Indian authors, and then we're relying on a lot of Western authors, and we're not actually often teaching African writers around these issues. But the second thing that I want to just raise is that I also think that I resonated quite a lot with what Ananya and Kushi were saying about India, which is that in South Africa, the IR discipline is so untransformed and colonial still. So the really interesting decolonial work is happening in other disciplines, and then will sometimes feed into IR. But our IR curricula are no different. They're actually more backward, so to speak, in terms of they're less progressive than IR curricula in European universities or in the US, right? They're still very much standard realism, liberalism, constructivism, and then like a little bit of like critical something. But you don't learn the decolonial IR, you don't do race in South Africa of all places in IR. And so I think that there's part of it is also the structure of knowledge production that means that universities in the global South are so concerned with meeting the standards set by the global North and all of those rankings and all the rest of it, that there's such hesitance to write from our own position because then we'll fall in the rankings. And that concern, I think, is a really big one.
Wow, thank you very much. I mean, there's so many thoughts here. I thought I'd also sort of add on to sort of a bit of that autobiographical element when I heard about sort of the whole decolonization thing. First, I agree with Ananya. I mean, you don't hear about, you know, Fanon and other people in Indian IR. I mean, I'm very embarrassed to sort of acknowledge it, but the first time I actually read Frantz Fanon's name was in MPhil, when we were being taught, I think, Vijay Prasad's book, The Darker Nations. That sort of opened, you know, a whole lot of things for us. And I'd always wondered that why is it that these Indians, you know, it sort of hegemonize the post-colonial whatever field, but no one does it in IR. You know, if you just walk across from our school, you know, to political science and history, everyone was doing post-colonial stuff, but not in the School of International Studies. And I'd always wondered why. My sort of introduction to Decolonizing IR was actually a conference organized in Singapore. I think this was the first Global South conference or something. And the first big panel was a panel on decolonizing the curriculum. And I went there and everyone on the panel was from a Western university. And I was like, so this is a conference about the Global South, in supposedly the Global South or the periphery. There were debates about whether Singapore is global or not. And everyone on the panel has flown in from America or England to tell us about how to decolonize our curriculum. That I found really weird. And I eventually sort of, you know, I mentioned it, but how do you sort of reconcile this thing that you're talking about decolonizing, but everyone is from a Western university, and they acknowledged that, all of that. But also then I went to South Africa, and Chitambile is right. I mean, the first thing that when you go to race hits you, race is in everything, right? You know, you can't think about anything, the structure of your bed, you know, whatever, you know, every little bolt, there's race in everything. And then you start reading a whole lot of these people that Chitambile mentioned, and suddenly you realize, you know, the decolonizing IRs in the discipline is sort of a very second order, sort of secondary kind of literature review kind of stuff, which then you get, a lot of the stuff about decolonizing IR and all that, to me, that's sort of, I kind of read it as sort of a, reproduced from other disciplines, which is also partly why I'm sort of a bit, angsty about the whole decolonizing IR thing. And those are the kind of, everybody produces those as citations of original work in IR, but the original work happens somewhere else, inside them. So that is my sort of, one of my concerns with decolonizing IR. All right, should we move to the next issue, or does anyone have more thoughts on it?
I have.
Yeah.
on your presentation, but I wanted to get back specifically to Sashi's point about breaking the system within the system.
Sorry, can we just sort of limit that, because next point is exactly that.
Okay.
So we'll come to that, but anyone has things on decolonization, representation, and then we come to the methodology part. Yeah, Khushi.
I just probably will come to this later, but what was mentioned earlier with regard to employability, right? And you spoke about the expats to the Western universities who then work on decolonial IR. It's also probably important for us to keep in mind that there are not enough resources in this part of the world to actually probably do the kind of research that you want to do, and especially with the way the governments are functioning. So I think that is also something that needs to be kept in mind for why decolonial IR per se, if it has to develop, is also not developing, because anyway, there are not resources. And then whatever is, we are not even a discipline in India. So how much will we get? So yeah.
Just thanks so much for raising that, Khushi, because I think that there are no resources for research, but also resources are so constrained for teaching. And so, we have these very large classes, 600, 700 students in a single class, and you've got them for 14 weeks, and you end up teaching these survey courses where, it's introduced as much about IR as possible. And you get very constrained then within that to do the canon, right? So the Western canon. And so that your opportunity to then to experiment, to diversify, to show a different perspective is limited, because you also don't want to prejudice those students if they then want to do postgraduate studies in the West, right? So you want to teach them or introduce them to their waltz and everyone, get that done in the undergraduate so that they'll be prepared for postgraduate studies abroad. And so there's just not enough academics, not enough resources to actually do the kind of depth of teaching that we'd like to.
If I may just very quickly, I'll be very quick here. Very quickly add is also this, that do you have, from what Sitaman said, that do you have the luxury to sit and think and then write? That I think that is a very important question, because on one hand, you of course have governments which are hostile to public universities, but at the same time, the way the universities and how teaching is designed, if you're in a public university, if you're teaching in a public university, do you have that much time left with inadequate support as a PhD student to really sit and think and read and reflect upon the canons and then produce something? So, yeah.
Okay. So let me do this. Let me take sort of this thinking and methodology together. So a few years ago, there was this first Indian International Relations Conference, where everyone presented papers. And I remember Amitav Acharya came. He was he did his whole global IR thing. And that was, I think, one of the first lectures he gave on global IR. And basically lambasted Indian scholars for not doing theory. Like, why don't you do theory? And then there was this Indian professor, S.D. Muni, who came and basically went after Amitav Acharya, saying that, we taught you here, you did your MPhil, all that here, we gave you resources and then you left. That's a separate criticism. But then the other criticism he made was that exactly what Khushi said. The theory is luxury. We didn't have time for theory. We had more pressing issues to deal with. But also he then went a bit further and he said anti-theory, not doing theory is a form of resistance. We don't care about your theories. If you're not, because you hegemonize this whole political economy of everything, where only you can do theory, we don't care about it. We will, we'll not engage with it. We'll do our bilateral relations or whatever. So that's one part. But the second problem with this whole doing just bilateral relations is, like Shashi mentioned, there's this issue about methodology. One, of course, one of the things that we could talk about is some of the stuff that Shashi said, what is good methodology, whose work could be produced, and all of that. One of the ways that I thought about the security dialogue issue was that what if it was two scholars from the Global South? Could they ever even think of approaching security dialogue with the same piece? And we might disagree with whether methodologically it was right or not. So there's one element. But also, do we not acknowledge at all that there are issues with methodology concerning, a lot of issues that have been raised? I mean, there are problems of, funding. There are whole sorts of problems which lead to problems of not developing methodology. So for instance, I once did a paper on looking at one of the schools or centers, doing work in India. I don't want to name the center. And I looked at the PhDs and the MPhils that they produced in the last 40-year period. 89% and more of MPhils, and I think 86% of PhDs, the end date of their study was the end date of the year in which they finished their PhD. So for instance, if I'm finishing my PhD in 2020, the title of my thesis is Relations Between Country A and B from 1996 to 2020. So it is no more about, because it's current affairs you're doing, doing research. And the problem is not the students. The problem is the professors not telling them that, you can't do this. You need to have, say, 5 or 10 year gap in order to have, primary or secondary material available. In fact, there was one study which was done in 72 about, bilateral relations or some countries' relations from 74 to 78. So which is like blue skies research, you're thinking about the future. So the problem is there is a problem about, the lack of training in methodology and all that. So do we completely negate that? But also, how do we then address the other issue that Shashi was talking about, that there are issues about who is considered, methodologically nuanced and so on and so forth. Yeah, who wants to go first? Anya.
Yeah, okay. I had 2 quick points, maybe just adding on to the conversation. I think just the value of research itself within the Global South, I don't think it's seen as an activity that is valued enough, that's worthy enough. And I think there's a societal factor, there's a larger systemic issue, like Khushi and Sitambra mentioned about funding. But I think it's also about societal values, about so what are you doing with your time instead of doing earning money or getting a job. And I think that's something that one needs to address and have more conversations about. Your point about theory versus empirics, I think that's something Gopal Guru's written in the context of caste as well, where he says that, only Brahmins can theorize, and of course everybody else will work on the empirical stuff. So I think that divide is something that we probably have to think about also in terms of other kinds of hierarchies that exist.
Sorry, Anna, can I just add there, actually, the point you said? It also adds to what Khushi was saying earlier about the language itself, If you are good in English, you would be able to write theory and read Gayatri Spivak. Even if you come from a good English school, you probably wouldn't be able to read Gayatri Spivak. So it's that kind of a thing. It's not even just knowing English. It's sort of knowing a particular kind of language, which is there are caste and class issues and race issues sort of involved there.
Thanks. And just last point to Shashi's point, I think I don't have an answer, but I was just thinking of issues of translation, questions of translation, and the idea of intention, particularly in the time that we're living in. Maybe take a text from Savitri Devi or some other Indian freedom fighter at a particular context, appropriate it and say this was our large, great Indian tradition of writing in a certain way, and using it in a larger alt-right Hindutva kind of narrative would be quite interesting to see. So I don't know what is the distinction between indigenizing, decolonizing, and are there parallels here, and can you go back and say, oh, but we're working on Indian scholars and producing IR stuff, everybody researches on Kautilya and says Kautilya and statecraft, that's your contribution to IR theory, because you're oh, let's do mainstream realism by talking about Kautilya, and that's it. So I don't know, are we treading thin lines when we're thinking about this? And to the question of language, I'm not sure. The idealist in me says, I don't think it's a language problem. I think we have to be equipped better in terms of teaching certain concepts. Why is realism easy? It just doesn't make sense to me that states are rational actors. They have certain capabilities. They're going to, the 5 assumptions. Anybody, a 3-year-old boy can learn, and I say boy with like whatever, can learn those assumptions and like carry on with it. I don't know if it's only about language. I think we do not put in the effort to make Spivak, I don't know, relatable. I think the onus lies also on teachers and teaching difficult concepts easily. I think that's the job. I don't know. Yeah, that's it.
I just want to build on that. So I was actually last week, I was on a webinar hosted by Makerere University, and Spivak was speaking, and she said, you know, that the Candace Velton speak. She's like, she was so fed up with the draft, and she sent it to the publisher, and she said it's not actually properly edited. So she's like, if you don't understand it, it's fine. It's not understandable. So she was kind of, but I get, and what I want to do is build on this point. Why is realism so yeah, you can teach it to a 3-year-old boy or whatever. And I think that, you know, I remember having the shock of my life, and I read it, and full admission here, I just never read it during my MPhil or my undergraduate studies. But when I was doing my PhD, I read 20 Years Crisis by E.H. Carr. And one of the things that struck me about it, I was like, oh man, this is just a story of what happened in Europe between 1919 and 1939. Yet it's this big theoretical text. And, you know, it takes me back to the point that Vineet was making about the person who is like, we don't have the luxury to do, or theory is luxury. And this distinction between the theory building that happens in the North and then the empirical work that happens in the South, is itself a subject, is itself a function of power relations, right? Because we call theoretical, we label empirical work from the North as theoretical. E.H. Carr's 20 Years Crisis is an empirical text. Yet it is, you know, if it had been written by an African or by an Indian, it's a description of a particular set of things that happens in a particular place. But it's now this foundational theoretical text in IR. And so we also, I think, by creating this division between the theory and what's theoretical and what's empirical, we reify theory as if it has always existed, it will always exist as it is. And we take away from the fact that theory comes from a particular context. The theories that we talk about, that we use in IR, start as a description of a set of things that are happening in a part of the world. And we've taken these theories from the global North and we try to sort of fit them to the South, instead of looking at what's happening in the South theoretically as something that can create theory itself. And our methods then for trying to do that, one of the best articles I've read this year, and of course I'll forget the title now, by Olivier Ritazibra in Millennium, the February edition, and it's a book review, but it's told in this narrative way. It's exquisite, and those methodologies of telling story, of singing, of poetry that many of us come from in terms of our cultures aren't accepted as legitimate by the North. So the way in which we speak ourselves is limited by what's accepted in the North. And so we constantly remain these sort of theoretical minors, compared to the senior North.
Can I just jump in here? A lot of the conversations, I think, revolve around who gets to theorize, what experiences can we theorize about, and this was exactly the conversation I was having with some of my students this morning that got me so agitated, right? And one of my students is working on these concepts of empowerment and agency in development studies, right? And she's looking at what women in the informal sector in Gujarat are doing in relation to empowerment. And there was something that she said when we were having a conversation that really struck me, right? And in her process of grappling with writing her thesis, right? So on the one hand, she says, oh, well, there's all these theoretical things, and then there's these things that the women are doing, right? And to me, I'm like, okay, so the question is indeed, right? Like, if you do the math, I mean, how large is the informal sector in India? And how many of informal workers or workers in the informal economy are women? That's like, I don't know, a few million people. And surely representative of a great chunk of humanity, right? And she has, and then my student, poor her, poor student, right, has, on her shoulders this responsibility of theorizing about these women's experiences. And the question is whether, lucky for her, right, doing her thesis in the global north, then she has all these resources, and she has conversations with people like me, right, that would enable her to do that, right? So the question is whether who gets to theorize about whose experiences and whether there are capacities to allow that to happen, right? And thinking about my own personal journey, I didn't learn how to theorize until I started doing my PhD, right? And that wouldn't have been possible if I didn't move to Singapore and I didn't do my PhD in Singapore in a political science department that is full of scholars who were trained in or who were from the global north, right? So it's a capabilities question. It's not just a matter of will as well. And I just wanted to point that out. And about languages, I was thinking exactly about Spivak, right? And the first time that I read Spivak, I was like, oh my God, I think you need to know about like French philosophy, post-structuralism, and the phenomenon of sati in order to make sense of it, right? But so I think the metaphor of languages is important, right? In order to translate, to make all of these different translations, right? To make visible informal workers in India, women workers in India, to the rest of the world, right? I think I'll stop there. I have other things, but I'll stop there for now.
If I
would like to interject here. Sorry. I would like to make a couple of points. The first one is about capacity and resources that most of you have spoken about. But I was wondering to which extent we can have this conversation about decolonizing IR outside or disconnected from the real world of international relations, the real world of global affairs, the real world of the maldistribution of wealth, of resources, right? So we're talking about people in international relations in the global south not having the resources to be able to engage in knowledge production and to engage in this discussion. But I was also wondering whether it also has to do with the fact that they are located in countries that are, in actual fact, not decolonized. They are engaged, they are doing scholarship in countries that are still dependent on the global north. So I think probably we should also think about making that connection between what we are doing in IR as a discipline and what's actually going on in the real world. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but I wonder whether we could successfully decolonize the discipline if the real world itself is not decolonized, right? So I think this is where we should talk about the sort of knowledge and power relations, right? So for instance, who gets to determine what are the topics, what are the issues we should research in the discipline? I think that's a power relation question, right? when you study international relations, even in the global South, there are many times you are engaged in things that are of interest to the dominant powers in the world, right? So I think in a way we need to make that connection. Otherwise, I wonder whether what we are doing in the discipline will be able to get the impact as we expected it. The second point that I want to make about sort of the knowledge production methodology and the dissemination of the knowledge that we produce, and it's tied to the first point that I made. I think it's also a question of the audience. Who do we want to speak to? Who do we want to engage, right? So I don't think there is I don't think there is one way to look at that. For us, for instance, who are in geographically located in the global north or in the global center, we have a reason to aim to publish in certain journals, right? And that in itself limits the way or limit the liberty that we have, right? To think about the way we write, to think about the methodology that we want to use. Because if we aim to publish in certain journals, then in many ways we are obliged, right, to publish our work or to write according to the standards that have been set for you to be able to publish. And I think we should be realistic about this, right? Because when I did my PhD in Canada and I wanted to apply for an academic job here, I was aiming at certain journals. And these journals have a requirement in terms of the way you should write, the way you should prepare your manuscripts and all of that. But like I have said, I think it is about the audience, because if we have a diverse audience, then we should be talking also about how do we democratize knowledge production, right? So people who are located in the global south, in Sierra Leone, maybe this is not their audience, right? They can have other forms of representation, other forms of producing knowledge. I think when we talk about the democratization of knowledge, we should respect the way they produce knowledge, the methodologies that they use, right? Because they have a different audience and probably they have a different problem they are trying to look at. I think part of this conversation is trying to, in a way, sort of dismantle the hierarchy that has been built in knowledge production. So for this time, when we talk about theory, we are talking about theory as if there's one way to do theory. When we talk about method, we are talking as if there is one correct way to do methods, right? I think all of these have to be democratized and to give value to other alternative ways of producing knowledge. And when I talk about this, I think, for instance, the way indigenous people produce knowledge, right? We can't sort of impose the way knowledge is produced in the global south on them, or people who are doing work on those issues. I think it's a question of democratizing knowledge production so that we can respect the way they produce their knowledge. I always rant, but I just thought that this is one way we could sort of expand the conversation to really make those connections so that we don't isolate this discussion from what is going on in the real world.
Chee, you had a point to say earlier. Sorry.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, actually, I'll speak after Shashi speaks. So.
No. I think Kushi and Shashi gets confused all the time, so don't worry. Go ahead.
Okay. No, what I was just saying was, like where I disagree. Like I agree with Ananya to the point that, of course, it's like you can teach the tenets of realism easily, but I also feel that. And speaking more from experience, it's also important to realize that you're also then engaging in knowledge production yourself, right? You're reproducing, you're theorizing. That ability to theorize requires a certain kind of skill. If I speak of myself, I think I can talk, but can I theorize it when I write? I'm extremely underconfident about that. And this is when I have good enough access to a decent vocabulary and language. So I think what I said was in that sense that when you are writing, and what Sise said, that you're writing for a certain audience and you want to be accepted, right? And particularly if you're a first generation scholar, because we also need to keep that in mind. If you're a first generation scholar who's absolutely new and doesn't have anyone to guide you or fall back on or any of those things, you will be drawn towards things which give you that degree of confidence, probably, that you think you can write with ease and you can argue for yourself with ease without making a fool of yourself, because that's a big fear. At least that's a big fear for me, that am I making a fool of myself when I'm writing? uh, and and that is what we have to keep in mind, because theory is, at least from whenever I have spoken about it with peers and everyone, theory is always supposed to be sophisticated. I don't understand that sophistication of theory. If I have to read it 10 times and look up in a dictionary and then go back and try and understand and then evaluate whether I'm intellectual enough and then judge myself, then probably it just like beats the purpose of that theory. So just a thought there.
Sashi, so before you speak, I actually have a question very much tailored to you, while you also ask other questions. But I also want to sort of say something about the writing thing. Just after my PhD, because you're so impressed with jargon, right? And if you're trying to be post-colonial scholar, you want to use all your jargon. So I wrote this piece that I was very proud of, and it eventually came out in a good journal, IPS. And when the proofs came in, I remember I was sitting in Kirstenbosch in Cape Town with my mother-in-law. I was like, you say, oh, give it to a layperson to read. I gave it to my mother-in-law to read. In 5 minutes, she was sleeping. She was enjoying her nap. And that was sort of a big, boom for me. Like, so who are we writing for? Because no one really understands what we write. And after that, I sort of tried to de-jargonize myself as far as possible. I mean, though it's not completely, but to writing simple, I think is actually an art, and that all of us kind of have to sort of learn at some point. What I wanted to ask Sashi was, because I think Sashi is sort of very interesting in a way, because he does proper theory work, right? But you do it with case studies which are actually non-Western. And a lot of times that's, I think what Sidham Miller was saying earlier. So, Western experience, because it is universal experience, if you do a Western case study, it's a theory, I was listening to this sort of podcast the other day. Barry Bouzan was responding to Audrey's book on Western dominance, and she had taken India and Brazil as case studies. And he was like, how can you universalize about Western dominance from these two countries? I'm like, but that's most of your work. You generalize from 1, 2, 3 Western countries. No one questions your universalization. So it's that kind of thing. So, but you do proper theory, but your case studies are Brazil or India, with one case study. How do you handle that issue of universalizing from a single case study, that too from the non-West?
Thank you. I think this is a good question, because this also shows to a large extent how we have idealized theory. And Kushi, if I may, it is to say, have you watched the movie Ratatouille? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly in French. Any rat can cook, so anybody can do theory. The whole understanding that only some sophisticated people with some amazing philosophical / ideas or thinking can only do theory it's completely wrong. It is wrong because it is perpetuated by a particular system who can write in that way, who can produce so many research works that kind of shows a particular sophistication that we are not used to. But once we are used to a particular vocabulary, we kind of think like, okay, this is a particular way of actually representing or portraying the world. So doing theory is like the rat trying to cook. It's about just being embedded in a particular vocabulary for a longer time, and anybody can do theory. And that also means that the traditional distinction that we make between theory and empirics must also be questioned. That theory involves a particular sort of making connections and making presentations, representations, and so on. And empirics is actually going in the field and doing ethnography or field work and whatnot. I think theoretical filter. The one thing the Western scholars are able to do that is they are very good at making it explicit what their theoretical underground is, what is the theoretical kind of uptake is. And then once they make it explicit, they kind of make it explicit as if it is actually making sense for everybody who would actually be making sense of it. Whereas when I was studying international relations in India, I think most of us don't make those sort of implicit theoretical assumptions explicit. And a particular socialization we had, at least I had, studying international relations from Western universities and now being in the West, is that to game the system, you need to know how the system functions. And the way system functions is to show that the kind of work that you're doing is just applicable broadly. It's just objectively true, perfect, clear, understandable, reachable. And this is the problem that I have all the time when people say I am doing decolonization or non-Western theory, but I'm not able to do theory. But by virtue of the fact, when we are studying South Africa, India, Philippines, or Sierra Leone, or any other country, we are doing decolonizing IR. It doesn't have to be in a particular vocabulary because it immediately has to reach a particular audience, the reviewers particularly, and the journal articles, who immediately ask the question that Vineet asked: how can it be generalizable? I've had this question all the time. Oh, your case is only from Brazil. What sort of generalization you can do? Oh, your case is only from India or China. And here we can make two distinctions, right? One is a logical generalization and the other one is empirical generalization, which itself comes from my own talking with Patrick Jackson here, is the notion that not that my own theory, my own empirical analysis of a particular country is generalizable. Not that the same sort of political action that goes on in Brazil or in China or in India is perfectly replicable in other parts of the world. But the logic with which certain sort of game is played can be seen as a prototype with which we could make certain comparisons, similarities and dissimilarities. And that is a very valid point because what we see so far is much of entire IR theory is based on one case study on the United States. You write a theoretical work on the United States, nobody asks any question. Whereas you write a theoretical work using just one case study from Sierra Leone, everybody's up in the arms. It's not objective enough, it's not good enough, it's not right enough. I think that is the problem, which is a systemic problem in how do we make sense of using certain case studies, which everyone thinks as a unique case, which doesn't appeal to a larger problem. And this comes to a very important point that Ananya made, and which we could perhaps discuss a little bit more, is that there is indeed a distinction between indigenizing, decolonizing, and Hindutvaizing, let me say, if there is a particular word, of doing particular works. Oh, I'm doing decolonizing work, I'm bringing Indian scholars to international relations. Maybe, perhaps, I'm not doing it, but I could say that. But the same sort of claim can be made by a particular person who's committed to Hindutva ideology, saying that I am doing decolonizing work by bringing Sarvakar into the particular set of conversation. So this is a methodological problem, because how do we say that one particular way of doing theory is correct, whereas the other sort of doing theory is wrong? In other words, what is the way we could distinguish between right form of doing theory and wrong form of doing theory? And that is a question that decolonized, international relations or non-Western international relations has not answered yet. Whereas traditional positivist work has answered it very well. Not very correctly, but very well, because they have certain indicators about what is a right sort of conclusion one could derive from what sort of measurement indicators, and how we could make a conclusion out of it. Whereas non-Western international relations theory, no matter who does it, cannot come to a particular sort of claim to show that how we are wrong, unless we engage in a relativist game, saying that, well, if this interpretation, what I give, is overruled by a particular set of empirical indicators that would be proven in a particular archival records, then my claim that I'm making right now is potentially wrong. How many of us are really making those claims? I did not make that claim when I wrote the international relations theory base. Perhaps I should have. It is those set of problems, I think, that we might want to discuss in terms of a manifesto, in understanding what exactly can make for a good theory versus a wrong theory. Not that whether we can do theory or not, everybody can do theory. Whereas what is it? What are the indicators when someone says, no, this is a particular wrong sort of theoretical categorization. Every theory is a particular representation of reality, perhaps a simplification of a complexity, and why that simplification is just not good enough. And how do we go about it? Must be a sort of a conversation starter, and that involves having more articles written on the subject rather than a conversation stopper that muzzles conversation saying, you didn't do this, so it's a deepfake methodology, sorry.
Does anyone want to respond to that? Can I quickly ask everyone, if you had to give one practical suggestion or what you do yourself in order to sort of, handle some of the methodological concerns you get. So what I do is I publish with other people, and Shashi's usually sometimes, gets to bear the brunt of that. But I publish with a lot of other people to know, how to write differently, also to sort of enhance my own skills, but also it helps you if you, as a historian, I'm now more of a historian, if you think with somebody who's done theory, Sashi thinks completely differently, it helps me a lot. Also conversations like this, for instance, where you don't have to go to ISA or BISA to, talk to people of sort of similar interest. That to me is a very practical way of doing it. But if you have other suggestions or things that you do yourself. Who wants to go first? No? Should I be sort of start naming people? Ananya, you're sort of the first on the screen, so I'll go with you.
I think just having conversations, it's always nice to send out something and have people comment on your work, or have conversations about an idea that you have. Even not just peer groups, because I guess PhD is kind of isolating like that. I think the teaching bit helps because then you have younger minds also explaining something to them really helps, because if you can get across an idea that you were thinking about to those people and get feedback, I think that's a good practice to have, or just flesh out certain thoughts. So send it to not just seniors, but also younger people, and have conversations with them about what you're desiring to do. Yeah.
Others?
I just have conversations. I think what Ananya said, that really helps. And one thing that really helps me is that I somehow just end up having conversations with people who are also not from the discipline, and try to explain to them what I'm working on. And those are actually the good moments, because sometimes they say something which seems very commonsensical and I haven't even thought about it, because I want to be very academic about it, which is important. But I think those conversations also bring some value to your idea and how you further flesh it out.
Yeah, I've definitely found that having conversations with people from outside of the discipline has been really important, especially for around some of the vocabulary things. That sometimes it's a lot easier to be introduced to a particular concept, to a way of thinking, using language from another discipline sometimes, than using IR language. And so that has been really helpful. And then just engaging with other, in my case, all the scholars, to just test out my thinking around things. Yeah.
I'll just add in caveat, I am not published as yet. So this is all happening in my head as a PhD student.
I would like to say that I agree with all of what you've said in terms of engaging in conversation with other people who are your peers, but also people who are established scholars. My first two publications were joint publication with somebody that I consider to be a senior a colleague, and we had a lot of conversation around methodology, but all of those conversations, going back to what I said, were mostly informed on the audience that was our target, right? So if we wanted to publish in a particular journal, we'll be looking at what kind of methodology that particular journal is much more interested in. But I also consider myself a bit fortunate, because now I am teaching in an interdisciplinary department. I am no longer in IR. My department is called the Department of Social Science. and we have all sorts of social science disciplines. So I'm engaging in a much broader conversation about methodology. But again, it's sort of this weird position that you find yourself, which is that if you want to publish something in IR, then it's a question of how applicable is the interdisciplinary approach that you think you're proud about to be able to publish in an IR journal. But I think I consider myself fortunate because the kind of conversation that I'm having now in the department with my colleagues, I didn't get that conversation when I was doing my PhD or when I consider myself to be in an IR discipline.
Liberty, can I ask you something? You do something really wonderful, which is you read your papers and you make audios and they are on YouTube. I mean, I really enjoy listening to them. Why did you think about doing it?
I thought, well, okay, I'm spending all this time, right? Like all this time thinking about this and writing about it, and I want to share it like with the world. Surely, it can't just be behind, these gated websites of publishing companies and other scholars who have access to these websites. I mean, surely they're not the only audience, right? But I'm actually quite grateful to all of these pirate sites that upload all of this stuff. I'm already on there, so I'm probably getting a lot more eyeballs than the official metrics. I probably shouldn't say that, but so I thought that it's important, right? Like that you're devoting so much time and energy in your life, your passion to these things, and who gets to read it, right? And for what purpose? And so that's the reason why. And also I think I've thought about responding to the question that you asked earlier, about my own life and my own journeys and how that has informed my thinking and the way that I approach the practice of scholarship and where I think I belong in it. And the past 10 years has been a life of, I would say, hyper flexibility and mobility, right? I've moved so many places in the last 10 years, and to continue calling myself a scholar and continue doing scholarship, it's as though I have a feeling that I need to keep moving even more, right? And this happens within the context of universities structurally changing into enterprises, right? And the logics that encourage flexibility and mobility, right? I mean, the European Union has all these funding schemes that encourage exactly that. I was just looking at this like a funding program in Germany where they require you to spend 12 months in another university and then 6 months back in Germany or something like that, right? And this is a funding scheme open to from everyone around the world. So I was thinking about this, right? So why is there this push for this mobility, right, for scholars to move around the world and I thought, well, yeah, it takes place in this idea that everything should be super flexible and the university is like this enterprise, right? And corollary to that is and necessarily like linked to that is precarity, where I have uprooted myself so many times, right, in the last 10 years, and I was thinking of this concept that was used by this Japanese scholar when she discussed migrant sex workers in Thailand, where she says, well, what distinguishes the condition of sexual sexual slavery on the one hand and sex work on the other, right? And she talks about this idea of social death, right? Where if you feel that you're not in a situation where you have access to community, to social resources, it reduces your feeling of autonomy, and your feeling of capacity, right? So depending on what resources is available to you, you feel more or less autonomous, right? You feel like, on the one hand, are you a sex slave? On the other, are you a sex worker, right? So I was thinking about this, right? So I moved here. I didn't know anybody here, you know, and the university is structured in a way that doesn't really pay attention to, like, okay, there's this person, there's this researcher moving from somewhere outside of Europe. What can we do to kind of make her life easier, right? It's not there. It doesn't exist, or for whatever reason, right? So this constant mobility, this constant idea that, okay, if I want to, you know, stay working in IR and be an academic, I need to do all these things, reduces actually this capacity to write something in a way that we want, right? So I need to stay employed, therefore I need to please the agenda setters in my discipline, and of course this functions within the institution of academia, institution of university, which is full of hierarchy and power asymmetries, right? Just in the everyday functioning of it, right? And then you include all these other identity stuff. I'm not white, I'm a woman, you know, I didn't train in the global north, right? And that all adds up, right? To move you more or less, you know, in this quadrant, in degrees of more or less autonomy. So I was just thinking that. Sorry, yeah, that was my rant.
I just want to say only one thing, given that we need to raise this issue of what are the sort of practicalities involved. I think we need to, only after talking to Vineet, or maybe to many of other scholars at in the Goa meeting and subsequently, I think writing clearly is an art, and I don't do that. And we need to give up on the assumption that when someone says, I don't understand your writing, as an insult. When someone says, oh, I don't really understand your writing, it is a bloody damn insult, because if an educated person cannot really understand what you're writing, then what the hell are we writing for? And then I devised a particular technique, which I don't know if it's going to be useful for others, but it has been tremendously useful for me, is to write down the entire argument, what I want to really say, and then really restart the entire paper again. That is, to erase, because only by concluding the writing, I kind of arrive, this is what I want to say. And then you restart the article or an argument, starting with the understanding that this is what I want to say, and I'm going to say it like this and this and this. So it is a particular game of going back and forth in our own writing, and it goes into several drafts for sure. And that has really helped me, because when we were writing articles with Vineet and others, not with others, I only wrote with Vineet. It is about just to get the ideas. Okay, this is what I want to say. Okay, perhaps this should be foregrounded instead of like it's being hidden. And this kind of comes through practice, I guess. And none of us are trained in sort of writing in many ways. And if we all want to be good writers, we'd rather be in fiction field, right? We'd rather want to sell Harry Potter, write Harry Potter books and sell them, rather than to be in academic world. So academic world is actually also saying that we know the art of gaming the system by writing in a particular way. And here is my argument, here is a sort of evidence for the argument, here is the claim, and these are the sort of implications the claim has in a broader field of international relations, or philosophy of science whatsoever. And if you take these implications seriously, then we'll have a new sort of thinking on X, Y, and Z factors. That's it. But nobody arrives at like this unless you're Descartes, you're just sitting and meditating. You can't arrive at those things. It arrives at only after we write the entire draft, at least for me, comes, this is my central research question, bloody hell. And then I go about writing the article saying that this is my central research question. And this kind of comes up again and again in our paper, in our discussions. So if I'm true to what I just said, then by virtue of that, we need to erase all the recordings which we did right now, and then come back to 5 principles we've been talking again and again in this discussion. One is translation, audiences, as Ceci said, democratic knowledge production, how to theorize international relations, and international relations is for someone and for something, and how do we go about it. These are the 5 themes that kind of comes up again and again in the discussion. And kind of this concrete aspects of these 5 things came about only through discussions, not before or ex ante. Although we had certain pointers that Vineet pointed out, the concrete aspects of how do we do these things come out through discussions, right? And once we have a sort of these pointers, then we can go about having substantive discussions on what does it entails to do a translation which doesn't veer towards a Hindutva sort of translations of E.D. Sarwarkar. How do we engage in audiences that are both audiences that are hidden, old audiences who are reviewers, and new audiences who are the global south audiences? And how do we understand democratization of international relations without actually saying anything goes, without actually going into relativism? So yeah, that's what I want to say.
Okay, can I quickly say one thing on writing and then move to the points that Liberty raised about precarity and add issues about exploitation and bullying? I mean, and it's my experience of, I guess Ananya and Khushi will share the experience of, doing your PhD in India. We actually never learn, we never write enough, so you read a lot in MA, you do 1 year of MPhil, which is also taught MPhil, and then the second year of MPhil, you actually write your first research thing. And Ananya and I didn't even write MPhil. So the PhD is actually the first research, paper you're actually writing. So you've read a lot and you've never written anything. So which means that you never have a practice of writing. So I actually, and then, you somehow finished the PhD. So I went to South Africa and worked with my supervisor. I remember the first draft I actually gave him of paper that, I eventually published. He said to me, he read the paper, he said, Vineet, I learned a lot, but it's so boring and tedious and I didn't understand a thing. And I'm like, oh my God. And then he said something, there are these furnitures in your mind, which everything makes sense in your mind, but the reader doesn't. So you have to sort of try for the reader. And that really, flipped things in my mind. And, and then what Sasi said, you have to continuously edit and edit and edit. It's only after, 10th or 11th draft, you begin to get it. So that was sort of difficult for me because I used to write like first, second draft and then done with it, because then, like my PhD, I remember I must have just, revised it once, because then you thought that you've written the masterpiece and you're done with it. But that's not how it happened. So that has helped me a lot in terms of, because we are not trained to write. Unlike universities in the West where you start writing your BA thesis, MA thesis, and PhD thesis. But coming to sort of, Liberty has raised, issues about precarity, which is even worse in some ways for women, but also bullying, and that was clearly the case in the debate about securitization. And there are issues about exploitation. A lot of times, like us in the global south, those who study in the global, you don't even know that you're being exploited. You do a lot of work, labor, you're never paid because you don't even ever expect to be paid because you're doing it for some stupid certificate, or a lot of times even that is not provided for you. And so just to sort of recently there was an Indian professor who published something who published an op-ed, and she was called out for plagiarism. Now she sort of issued an apology saying that, oh, I'm sorry, I've spoken to the people I plagiarized from, and I've sort of clarified it with them. And she blamed it on her team. She said it's the problem of working with teams that, but it's actually a bigger problem. She's stolen credits from her team. But the thing is, in the Indian system, you don't even realize that you're actually exploiting those people. You're not ever giving them credits. And in a lot of cases in India that I know of, it happens that, supervisors steal your research, blah, 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 but the student will not even think about that being exploitation. So in each of your experiences, what are the ways in which you think, bullying happens, exploitation happens, and of course, there's a larger question of, precarity in academia, and what are the ways in which you've navigated these things? Who wants to go first? Ananya, again, you're on my screen first, sorry.
I think Khushi's raised her hand.
Oh, sorry, Khushi, yeah.
I'm just like, from what you said, and thankfully I haven't had such experience with, like I have very good supervisors and I really don't complain over there. But what you're saying, about work getting plagiarized, ideas getting stolen, and, the recent example that you gave. And I remember when I first started going out for conferences and, started discussing what I'm working on, again, as something which hasn't been worked upon before, one thing that I would often be told by peers who've been in the academy for a little while and who were seniors as PhD candidates. And they would just tell me, don't share. Don't discuss ideas. Ideas get stolen. Okay. If it's with an Indian peer, and somehow, it would also happen more with peers, or academicians or younger scholars who are located in Western universities, and the rationale would be that they have the resources. You'll discuss your idea, and then you'll keep sitting on your idea, trying to put it together, and they'll probably just get the funding and go ahead because they have access to that kind of funding. And probably we don't talk about this enough, but the way the system is designed, the way it operates, and what Liberty said that, and even Ananya said that right in the beginning, that PhD is something which is it's also a lonely journey in many ways, right? Because your family many a times does not understand what you're doing. A lot of your peers don't understand what you're doing. And the way the system is also designed, it also creates a sense of insecurity. Even with how much you share and to what extent you share, especially if you are young, you haven't been published, and you want to talk, but how much do you talk and where do you talk? And I'm a loudmouth, so I end up talking a lot. But if I keep that aside, I always come back and I'm told by my friends and all, and they're like, you are an idiot because you're not supposed to talk so much, especially if you haven't published as yet. So I think that is something that probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the young scholars that in my circle that I've spoken with, almost everyone shares a very similar insecurity over there. So,
yeah. I want to, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to, do the pointing out.
Yeah, so I just wanted to use the metaphor of globalization of knowledge production, right? Where you have a core that kind of gets all of these resources from the peripheries via research assistants for that knowledge to then trickle back up to the core and for the core to theorize and generalize about it, right? So there was an article that came out of the Antipode a few years ago where you had these research assistants. I think it was it in Syria? Somewhere in the Middle East, right? Where research assistants basically complained, right? That it wasn't just raw data that they were collecting, right? The exercise of being in the field, right? Was an exercise of theorizing itself, right? Which the scholar in the North, in the institution that funds it, kind of appropriates. So this is obviously a relationship of inequality and exploitation indeed, right? Not just in the labor performed by the research assistants, but also, the idea that you can expropriate data, right, from the peripheries, procured for you by these research assistants in sometimes very risky situations, right? And then for the scholars in the core to ruminate about. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to say.
Can I just ask Mohammed to say something, because he wants to leave it in 6 minutes, I guess. So yeah.
Yes, thanks for that. And sorry, Ananya. I would say that my experience of what probably could be defined as exploitation became something that I got aware of when I first came to Canada. I came as an exchange student. I was doing my master's, and it was for 6 months, and I did a lot of research work for my supervisor, and he published some of those work, and he just sort of had my name somewhere as an RA. And And one of my friend who is a Canadian, she was very pissed off. She was telling me that you've been exploited, but I didn't feel that way when I first came to Canada, because I came from Sierra Leone, where that's what most of my professors did, right? When I completed my first degree at the University of Sierra Leone, I worked for a very long time as an RA for one of my lecturers. And we did most of the field work, did most of the research, and he would just sometimes pay us off, and there was no acknowledgement at all in those publications. So I think for me, one thing I would say about exploitation and my personal experience with it, I think it's about power, right? For me, I think it is something that I have experienced even from people who I consider to be my own people, right? Like I've mentioned, even in Sierra Leone when I was there, I think some of the experience that I had to do with the power relations, and I didn't consider myself as having the voice to be able to ask for accountability or to be able to ask questions. And when I came to Canada as well, it was my Canadian friend who told them I needed to ask questions. I think there's that power relation and there that we need to talk about. Sorry guys, I need to go. I need to catch up on another meeting, but I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks, Vineet, and it's good to see you.
Thank you.
Ananya.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks. I was thinking of these three words: bullying, exploitation, and precarity, and just like kind of reflecting on like three different instances. One is, again, as somebody who's like in the Indian context, there's a constant culture of surveillance, whether you're situated in a public university or a private university, regarding what you teach, how you teach. So I think that's the culture of surveillance, auditing of reading lists. You need to take, there's hierarchies of approval if you have to get like a course approved clearly in the public context. But even within like other contexts, you have to make sure that you're doing enough IR even when you're designing like a course. And so that's something that's constantly on your mind while you're like trying to decolonize IR. Second, Liberty and others have mentioned, just the idea of double work, just being a woman, like young faculty, the teaching responsibility vis-a-vis like juxtaposing that to like other academic responsibilities. That's something that's quite strenuous. Like that's a life balance that you'll have to probably learn eventually, and that's something that people have to navigate with. But I think like the most obvious form of, I don't know, something that like I keep on reflecting on is this idea of tokenism. Just because you're a woman or just because you engage with critical like kind of IR, or like you don't do mainstream IR, you're almost like a symbolic token of doing anything that is related with like non-mainstream stuff. And that's a burden. I feel like that's such a huge responsibility. I might not know anything about race, right? Like that's not what I'm supposed to do. But because I don't do realism, somehow I'm entitled to do race, gender, anything that is critical, like anything that is to do. And that's a lot to put on like an individual person. I think it's harder to just like navigate those positions, because I'm sure there's somebody better within the Indian context, or like large, who has better scholarship hold over those subjects. So I think that's that tokenism, that you're like the token person who's going to speak on this thing. That's a huge burden in like just the larger context. Yeah.
Sithandela?
I want to completely agree with that. As a there aren't many Black women working on IR in South Africa, Vineet, as you'll know, and the sense that you are this token that gets sort of put into panels, that gets put in, so you do all of this extra work, and that leaves very little time for kind of thinking and reflection. It's one of the things that we are in a global pandemic, and it's a big crisis. But I have been so grateful just for the ability to sit still and not necessarily have to think about other people's work. I can think about what I'm interested in. And so that's been really important. I think that the other thing is that, and we've got it a lot in our context, is around the burden of teaching. So because there is this, and in our situation, a lot of the academics, senior academics are white and old. And so if you're a young, not white person, they will want to put you into you get burdened with a lot of teaching. And on one hand, it is this great service, right? Because you're like, when I was in first year, I wanted to see someone like me teach me. And so, you really want to do that. And it's incredibly fulfilling work, but it's also a lot. And it is, and that can be incredibly exploitative. And then the third thing also is, I think that being the only one or one of the few people that looks like you means that you necessarily do a lot more service work. So whether that is formal, so through the committees and all the rest of those things, or whether that is being a shoulder to cry on for students and being the person that people go to when they've got issues around things. And so it just means that there's a lot more that you have to do than other colleagues. And I think that because that kind of work isn't quantified in the metrics for success, right? So you can't say, look, I didn't publish anything this year because I was dealing with all of this, it doesn't count. In terms of our measures of success in the academy. And so it becomes this urgent labor that you do because you're responding to things as they're happening. But it can then become a hurdle to your own progression as a scholar.
I mean, I can vouch for that. I mean, you're probably the most visible person in South African IR politics and everything. And I can imagine everyone, sort of forces you to do all of these things from the department. And I mean, I asked you exactly because South Africa, I have to think of Zitem Relays. Apologies for that. I had one thing to say, but sorry, Sashi, you haven't.
Oh, wow. Now I have to think. So Sashi, do the thinking. Do the filler, sorry. No, I wanted to just talk about certain indirect, not sort of bullying, but a sort of indirect practices that's there in our field, which is quite important for us to notice, particularly when we engage with the Western scholarship, is their ability to judge us based on our accents. And that is a very serious problem because when we speak with a particular sort of, let's say, Indian accent or a Chinese accent or an accent from Latin America or Brazilian accent, it's immediate that they think that we're not worth it, that the ideas are not worthy enough. So the ability, we cannot do anything about it. So that has to come from their side. So that's why it's bullying in many ways, that they have to change that perspective. And that is very closely connected with genuflection, because anything in European IR that comes from Germany and the UK is considered amazing, whatever it is. Comparative regionalism, it's only Germany that has taken control of. No, anything that comes from the UK, when it comes to race scholarship, you have to be in the UK to do issues of race and color. And if you're not doing it in the UK, then you're not doing it enough. And any other scholars who do, let's say, interpretivist research would just immediately genuflect to anybody who comes from Germany or the UK, and see others who come, person of color or person with a particular sort of an accent, would be, well, you got to learn a lot. In other words, you have to not only learn to speak our vocabulary, but you have to learn to speak in the way we speak, which means for those who have learned to speak in the way they speak, both in terms of, or still learning, both in terms of their vocabularies of research, but also in terms of accent, then there is also a reverse bullying when I talk to my friends back home in South India. Why the hell are you having a particular type of an accent that is not there in terms of how South Indian Tamil would speak English? So it's kind of, you're always forever alienated among the society that you really want to be part of. And genuflection is a problem because wherever we go, this sort of visiting card mentality is like what institutions that you come from, what sort of articles that you published in, which journals that you published in matters more than what sort of ideas and substantive ideas that you have in terms of dialogues. So, and I've also contributed to this in many ways, because most of us are sort of aiming for top journals, top articles, top universities, top institutions. And that's also the notion of when everybody wants to be famous, that leads to sort of problematic bullying in many ways that says you're not good enough, you're not right enough, you are not speaking the Harvard style, for example, or the Oxford style of received pronunciation. If you don't do that, then you're not good enough. Well, yeah, I don't think so we can get out of that circle. And if we get out of that circle, we are being bullied back home in India, particularly when my own friend says that you've left India, you never know anything what's happening here. The ground reality is BJP is the most impressive power that's in India right now, and then good God save them. So if you say anything, then they are, yeah, the accented for a particular sort of a person who's not had Indian experiences coming and educating us. So we have to choose.
I will just add to what Sitambile and Ananya said, and it doesn't fall in this category, but when you go out and you apply for jobs or you apply for fellowships or grants or whatsoever, for which in the Indian context we are not trained. We are not trained on how to write a grant application, how to write a fellowship application. You literally learn on the field. But at the same time, you're witnessing a certain moment in Indian public universities, and not just Indian public universities, in other spaces also, where it's near impossible to do your research. It's near as impossible to just sit and work. And Ananya would understand, because we've had conversations, we've had some shared experience over there. So when you go out there, and because the demand to be productive is so much that, as what Sitambile said, that no one will ask you that what all were you dealing with so that you could not be productive enough when you went for that job application, which right now is probably applicable to a huge chunk of students who will then enter the academy, and how they are judged, and I'm a part of that, how we are judged, how our productivity is judged. Why didn't we make time to sit? Because, there would be times when you want to go for a protest, but then you remind yourself, but I have a PhD to write, and I have a review to send, or I have this and this to do. So I cannot go. And probably, I don't know whether I'm putting it right. It might sound like to some people an easy decision to make, but it really takes a toll. And it becomes near impossible to just sit and write or do anything in that environment. And that is also something that needs to be taken into account when we are talking about just the whole precarity of the whole academy in certain geographical spaces where certain governments are in power. So, yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Vineet. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to respond to what Sashi said earlier, right? So I think we have to, admit that when we enter these spaces, these very elite spaces, in a way, our very being, not just the way we speak, how we look, our view of the world causes a disturbance in the field. I mean, metaphorically and physically. And we have to grapple with that, right? So in my experience, people tend to kind of look over me or look past me until I open my mouth and start speaking. And then when I do, I have two reactions. There are people who suddenly see me as a peer, and there are people who are very eager to put me in my place, right? So I think if you experience this, the term would be a power move, right? Or bullying. When you experience that and someone who is structurally in a position of power over you, right? Let's say a senior scholar, does something to put you in your place, that's when you know that you're hitting a raw nerve. That's when you know that you're making a good point. Otherwise, they'll just ignore you, right? So I think it's a good indication, if somebody does this power move against you. That's all I'll say.
Can I just add to that? So, as Indians, we always are subservient to the white skin. You always feel inferior to the white skin. But I only get a kick when someone is trying to put me down, because then I'm like, now, then you feel like sort of giving it back. Otherwise, I'm always very subservient. I don't know. There's that inferiority complex that Indians have. But apart from this, some things that Liberty, you, I think, raised earlier were about, research funding, we providing whatever, research and somebody else doing it and all that. One of the things that that was a sort of big eye opener for me was when I first went to London to British Library. And I was like, it's so easy to write a piece. I mean, you can write an article in 5 days because here's all the material. You just have to pick pictures, come back, read and write. And because in Indian foreign policy or diplomatic history is basically an empty field, no one has done, apart from a couple of people, anything. So you can basically write on anything, go to British Library, click pictures, come back and write some story about something that happened. But you need to be able to go to the British Library. Everything is there. And because scholars from the Global South, it's very expensive to go there, one. So what I generally do is, I click pictures from every library that I go, but I sort of consider it sort of my responsibility to share it with people. So if somebody says to me, oh, I'm working on this, I actually share my material. Because it's not a work in the sense of, it's work in the sense that I've taken pictures, but beyond that, I've got funding, I've got whatever to do that work. I haven't done research work per se. So in that way, and I think and because a lot of us, we are lib gen generation, in a way, people before us were not able to do good PhDs because they didn't have access. We had access to all of it largely because of lib gen, right? So in a way, I also think it's kind of responsibility of all of us to help everyone else in terms of providing resources and everything. I mean, in terms of sharing what we write, in terms of, as long as you haven't, if you've read everything, you can't share and you can't give somebody a draft and say, oh, work on this and you're going to produce whatever. That you can't do. But in terms of, just access to resources, I thought, because now you can do it. Earlier you could not. And this sort of is an easy way to help people around. I don't know if other people have other sorts of examples.
Vineet, can I just add, not on this, but what Liberty and what Sasi were talking about, the accent and the visibility. And, I was just thinking about it, that the first ISA that I went to, and I bought a suit. I bought a proper suit, formal shirts and blazer. And that is, and I'm not the only one, I think, over here who buys a suit when they have, and that suit only comes out when I have to go to any Western conference, and when you're walking, at least for the first time, when you enter those spaces, it's very intimidating because you just somehow stand out. I remember I went, and I think I told you about this, I went to this one regional ISA conference and I was probably the only brown person there, or maybe 2-3 more, and there was just one very brief moment where I was walking through the corridor and I became very conscious about whether my shoes are making noise because I'll disturb people. Which shouldn't have happened, because, but it just happened, so just going there and then just physically fitting in is also an entire enterprise, which again, where again, I think the class comes in of who ends up going to these platforms where you engage with the West. Because I can afford that suit and I can afford to be there, someone else might not be. With such little public funding that we get in public universities, at least in India, we get peanuts and we all know that here. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, class is such an important conversation around access to the academy, both within our respective countries, but also in the global north. One of the things that I'm always struck by when I go to Western conferences or when I'm at a Western university is how much those Westerners that I'm engaging with are also from a particular class background. And so this universalizing that they do is from a particular class position that they're in. And, you know, by all accounts, it seems to have gotten worse, I think, in many places. And so, and their non-reflection of that in their own positions is astonishing, right? Because also in, I think certainly for India and for South Africa, because we live in such unequal countries, and we who can go to university, who live a middle-class life, are actually, we're so little, we're such a small fraction of the population. We are constantly aware of our class position at home. And in our, if you want to do critical scholarship or think critically, we're needing to constantly check ourselves and our own privilege in our own spaces. And that's why it's always so astonishing to me when I go to the West and I'm like, what the hell are you not thinking about this? You know, because even in your own society, you are hugely privileged where you are. And yeah, you can write about the poor Africans, but actually, have you been down the road in your, you know, in London to go see what's happening here? And they just, yeah, I think that dimension, and I think I see it a lot in IR scholarship in ways that, you know, because IR scholars write about theory and they're not really thinking about, you know, the stuff that sociologists worry about or whatever. They never really engage with that aspect of their bias in their work.
Can I just quickly respond to Koshi? I just want to say to you, you will never fit in. So embrace your difference, right? Like I paint my nails, I wear funky clothes, I don't care, right? So you can be a woman of color who paints her nails and be a university professor. I don't want to fit in because I never will.
So it's the first day of the conference when the suit comes out, and then I see some white dude walking around in his jeans and sneakers, and then I'm just like, okay, I'm done with it. But that first day of every conference, it's a suit. That does happen.
The higher you up in the hierarchy, the more privilege you have to wear a Hawaiian shirt.
That's actually very true. All right, guys, we're already way over 2 hours, but there's one point that we need to talk about. So let's try and spend 15 minutes on it, which is about responsibility. In terms of the work that we do, is it just an academic work, or do we see it as sort of, what responsibility do we have to society? But I guess in our case, it's also immediately, most of our responsibility is to the students that we teach, or the colleagues that we have, the networks that we build to each other. So how do we think about in terms of, responsibility? And this is a question that, I think Mohammed had raised about what is meant by solidarity and mutuality, and how, in what ways does it manifest inside the university space, but also outside the university space? Yeah. Who wants to go first? Kushi. Yeah.
I think I've been really lucky to find really kind people who are in senior positions who, help me get access to sources that I need for my work, or put me in touch with other people. Vineet, you are amongst them. So I think that has, in a way, been a big learning lesson that, where you can build your network because of your privilege, you build it, but then you expand it and take it home to someone who cannot physically be there. Which again is something that we have to consciously keep telling ourselves, because it's also very easy to get lost, because that's also how privilege operates, right? That it gets so normalized and you get so involved in that conversation, and it's your circle that you have to check yourself and tell yourself that, let me expand this circle and bring other people in as well. So I think that's something you have to keep going back and forth on. And like I don't even know like how well I also do it. I try to do it whenever I can do it, in whatever capacity when it comes to peers. But I think that is very important. Like I think generosity is very important. That's one thing that I learned really early on. You have to be generous and kind, and you won't really lose anything. And I think that builds a very firm ground for build solidarity, which is not just in word but also in practice. So yeah.
Ananya, I don't know. Ananya, yeah.
Oh, I think responsibility also could play out in like 3 axes, and maybe people can reflect on it. One, you have to be responsible in terms of choosing the kind of material that you're engaging with and like giving out. So you have to be very, very conscious of, I don't know, like it comes with training. So the first time I made an intro to IR syllabus, it was probably a replication of what I was taught in my master's. And then I realized, maybe I wouldn't want to like go back and look at like things the same way. So then you tweak it. You also learn it as you go. So probably just like looking at the kind of, and I don't think we think enough about pedagogy. I'm not sure. I think we're so self-consumed by just becoming, I don't know, big names in the discipline. I don't know what that means. I don't think we've been taught to think about pedagogy, like questions of pedagogy to train young minds. And the academy is increasingly becoming, I don't know, more and more narcissistic, self-obsessed about, I don't know, certain kinds of things. So I don't know what shape are we going to take there. Second, just co-teaching courses. I don't know that's a trend in India or not, but recently with all the police brutality that happened, etc. And I was talking to somebody who teaches anthro at some university, and they're like, oh yeah, but we actually speak about like global policing, whether it was post-Grenfell, whether it's in Brazil, and like these slums in Brazil. So it's a global problem. And I was like, dude, we could teach this in IR. Clearly there's a global dimension there. And I would have never thought of it. So maybe just like interacting and co-teaching certain courses would be interesting to give students also perspectives, so responsibility just in terms of not one particular narrative, but also like a larger narrative. And the last point was this term that Chandra Talpade Mohanty uses in her work on third world feminism. She says scholar-activist. And I found it quite interesting. I don't know how many of us qualify that, because there's something about armchair theorizing, like we like speak in similar like kind of groups. We have almost echo chambers in terms of like interactions. And I don't know, like if what we teach in our classrooms, I don't know. So I was doing this one piece by Rustam Barucha on passing as a Muslim, and there was CAA protests. I think Vineet was there. This is a conference that was happening. So I was like, why don't we take students to Shaheen Bagh to see the protest and understand what being a Muslim is in the contemporary context while you're reading something on being a Muslim. And I don't know, like, was that armchair activism? I don't know, like they just posted Twitter hashtags and Instagram pictures about the whole thing. But I think that's also a struggle, like in terms of responsibility. How do you balance the scholar activist part? So, yeah, thanks.
Can I very quickly add one thing? And that's just like my observation, and correct me if I'm wrong there, but there's another thing that, at least in India, the higher many a times you move in the academic circle, you know, your institutions keep shrinking, you know, like eventually it's like the same top 5 colleges, top 10 colleges, you know, you go to Stevens, you go to Hindu, you go to LSR, Xavier's, you know, then you go to Oxford, you go to Harvard. The institutions are of a very, very similar kind. And why this came to me, because I teach remedial classes, and one of my students came up to me the other day, and she comes from Rajasthan, you know, where I come from. And as an MA student, she just did not feel confident enough, because she said everyone else in the class is primarily from Delhi University, and they have read political theory a certain way, and they know these texts, and coming from a state university, I don't know this. So I don't know whether I have a future in the academy. And this is a fairly bright person, but I don't know whether I can last in the, you know, at least from what she thought at that moment. So I think that's also something that we have to consciously within ourselves keep reflecting upon, because, and I'm sorry I'm bringing this again and again, but class and access plays a very, very important role in terms of what characteristic that academy also takes, right? Like that's why institutions like JNU become very important, because they're so affordable that it becomes an equalizing space when you're doing your PhD there. which does not happen in case of, when you go to these Premier League colleges, which some of us also did go to. So I think that is also something we have to keep talking about when we're talking about the academy in general.
So Tambila, yeah, can I just say, you probably wear more hats than anyone of us here of responsibility. So perhaps your views on this.
So for me, so speak about responsibility in three ways. The first is, I think that responsibility of expanding access is really important, of using, and I know certainly I've been a beneficiary of that from both my my PhD supervisor, who hired me also to work at the university, Maxi Skuman, to all other professors, all sorts of colleagues who have used their position of power to open up access for me in different places and to get me into conversations that I otherwise wouldn't have been. And so I think that, passing that, paying that forward and creating the same kind of access, whether that is enabling access to funding or to conferences, or is important, is an important thing. And so that's a big part of my responsibility. I think the second part of my responsibility that I think about, particularly in the kind of the media work that I end up doing, and all these panels and things that I'm in, is to be very open about speaking from a particular position, and not claiming universality in what I'm saying, firstly, but also not distorting other people's life experiences. And, so knowing that what I'm very critical of with a lot of Western scholarship is this, someone will have come to, I don't know, spent 2 weeks in Nairobi, not even 2 days, and then leave as an Africa expert. And I'm so conscious of not wanting to be that person either. That to acknowledge, firstly, my particular position within the particular country that I come from, and being an urban person and not rural, and having grown up in a particular class, speaking a certain way, and to be responsible about that. I think that's definitely there. And then the final thing is, I think, to take responsibility for calling out the bullshit, right? So if you've got a bit of privilege and you can be in a particular space, then be in that space honestly. And take the risk of challenging the perceptions in that space, kind of no matter what, right? And it's easier said than done often, and it's easier to do in some spaces than in others. But I think that at least being aware of that makes it easier to live by that maxim. Yeah.
Sashi?
I just want to just follow up on that. And I think that I'll not have anything new to add with what Setambeli just said, because that kind of captures, and also what Liberty was saying, and pretty much everyone was saying. But just to summarize on these two things is to know that in terms of responsibility, there are two sorts of responsibility. One is the responsibility to the scholarly community of the Global South scholars. And one of the problems that we might as well face is the notion that we don't want to be so against each other when we have a bigger enemy to face, bigger problem to face, and bigger devils to deal with. And that exactly is the problem, because only Global South scholars among each other, and particularly think that they are better than the other. We don't have to have that competition. So that is a kind of a scholarly community sort of responsibility in terms of understanding that, okay, you come with a particular viewpoint, that's fine, fair enough. Let's see how we can help you build this viewpoint, and let's go on, because there is a bigger sort of mobilization and strategization which we might have to do in order to deal with bigger sort of stalwarts rather than fighting among ourselves, which involves sharing our notes, for example, and as Vineet said, sharing our archival information. Or, for example, when one of us have a particular sort of a grant, and sharing those grant information to others to subsequently apply for those positions, and also helping without any sort of like notion of reciprocity. We don't have to have any Global South scholar coming and thanking us, saying that, oh, you were helpful. It doesn't matter, because somehow some of us came to this position because some of us were helped, irrespective of who those scholars were. And I think in terms of scholarly responsibility, we might want to do that as a continuing project to others, sharing a global Dropbox file, for example, for people to access and have information. And the second sort of is the community, from scholarly community to the sort of policy relevant community, is that the distinction between critical theory and policy relevant research must go. I mean, that is absolutely wrong. It cannot really sustain any longer. Precisely this sort of distinction that critical theory is just existing in the sort of high cloud atmosphere, and policy relevant research conducted by exceptional think tanks like Carnegie Brookings are actually advising political makers, it's wrong. It has to go, and that has to come from Global South scholars, precisely because it kind of perpetuates the notion that academics just live in ivory towers and they're not doing enough. And some of the wonderful works in Indian international relations, particularly from critical, even if you don't label them as critical scholars, came from those who were critical of the Citizen Amendment Bill and the National Citizenship Registry and all those things. Are they not doing particular research? Are they kind of doing non-policy relevant research? Just because policymakers accept or do what we ask them to do doesn't mean that our research is policy relevant or not policy relevant. We have the responsibility to speak power to truth to power, and as well as power to truth. So I don't know. So breaking this responsibility involves, in order to say that what we are writing might not be picked up by a particular policymaker at a particular juncture, but still we'll be standing there to ask them to do a particular way in order to have a particular progressive understanding of how foreign and security policy must work. And the first sort of responsibility can be easily dealt with. We could create a global Dropbox folder, have a group of Global South scholars help us as we are helping others, because we're also learning with each other, right? The second one is really difficult. The second one rests on a fundamental assumption that works that are published in international relations theory or foreign policy analysis or international security are just useless. Actual foreign policy research comes from somewhere else. We need to break that, and I don't know how to do that. So the first one, create a Dropbox folder, that's fine and easily dealt with. Second one's hard. That's my take on this.
Liberty, you get the final word. But before that, I just want to acknowledge Whisk here. I mean, for Sashi's first responsibility, because Whisk has allowed a lot of us to sort of, it has brought a lot of us together without sort of Western intermediaries in some ways. So yeah, kudos to that. Liberty, last word to you.
Yeah, just on responsibility, I think I want to make a comment, and it's related to solidarity as well, right? So I think we need to be very mindful of the ways in which we as scholars are shaped into a certain way in order to function within these structures that we find ourselves in, that we are working in, right? And how we are shaped to be these hyper-competitive, continuously comparing yourself to others, neoliberal subjects, right? So the neoliberal academy obviously needs neoliberal subjects to function. And you have all these, very productive social forces that kind of shape you into thinking that way, into behaving that way, and for you to be the same as others, right? To fit in, right? So I think we need to be responsibly thinking about that and how that impedes solidarity. So yeah, that's it.
All right, that was a nice.
Now, before we close, what is your take, Vineet, on the notion of how do you exercise your responsibility?
by
What is
organizing.
what is it that what do you think about responsibility of international relations scholars from the global south or scholarship in general?
No, I agree with everything that everyone has said. That it's about you get a lot of things from others, but it's also paying it forward, but also paying it sideways, realizing that there are people who are not as privileged as you are, not because they're not good. It's just that you happen to be at the right place at the right time. In some ways, and all of us have our own ways of doing it. And all of us have to be comfortable with the way you do it. So for instance, so like for me, organizing public events is not kind of a thing that I'm very comfortable with, but I'm more comfortable with sharing stuff and that kind of thing. But also something that Kushi said earlier, kindness. I think I've learned this a lot in academia. People have been kind to me, and this is the best thing that you can actually give anyone else. And I've said it earlier, my postdoc supervisor paid for my wedding. So, so that's like being very kind. And I, that's one thing that I, personally want to embody. I'm sure I'm not always kind, but I think all of us can, try and do that in our personal capacities. But also, like Liberty said, there's also this danger of individualizing everything. We need to create solidarity and all of that, but also you need to hold institutions responsible, and we need to figure out ways of doing it. But yeah, so I don't know if I've given a definite answer, but I think there are ways in which you can do it both personally and sort of institutionally. All right, if no one has more things to say, I just want to thank everyone once again. I've enjoyed this conversation a lot. I don't know about you, and I've learned a lot today. I've taken a lot of notes, and it's going to help me a lot. But I hope this was a conversation that you enjoyed as well. And thank you so much again.
Thank you for putting this together, Vineet. This was
Thank you. Thanks
really
so much.
Thanks,
Yeah,
everybody.
it was so wonderful to meet you. Thank you.